Every day we live under the constant threat of Chinese military aggression, intimidation, coercion, and whatnot.
Dear friends, welcome to another edition of Forum 2000 Online Chats. My name is Martin L. I'm from the Czech economic daily Hospodářské noviny. Today we have with us Michael Cole. Michael is a Taipei-based senior advisor for countering foreign authoritarian influence at the International Republican Institute in Washington, D.C., where he is also senior non-resident fellow of Global Taiwan Institute. And he's also Magna Cum Laude Institute fellow from Ottawa.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
Michael, there is another congressional delegation this week in Taiwan. Chinese army is concluding this exercise, which was not comparable with anything we have previously seen around the island and the Taiwan Strait. Some observers in Europe fear that there is a new conflict emerging. Others say that China is still too weak to attempt invasion. So how do Taiwanese people see recent developments?
Well, for the Taiwanese, this is more, I would say what we have experienced in recent weeks is more part of a continuum than a sudden break with past practices on the part of the People's Republic of China. Every day we live under the constant threat of Chinese military aggression, intimidation, coercion, and whatnot. For months now, there has been continuous PLA activity near Taiwan, around Taiwan, getting near the median line in the Taiwan Strait. On an almost daily basis in the past 2 years, we have seen intrusions by PLA aircraft in the air defense identification zone in southern parts of Taiwan. So now we certainly saw a spike in military activity that was combined with a need on Beijing's part to express discontent over the Nancy Pelosi visit a couple of weeks ago. They used that as justification, but as I said, things have been moving in the direction where Chinese belligerence was more visible, it was more routine, and now we're seeing, notwithstanding the fact that the exercises have been terminated in the 6 boxes that they erected around Taiwan, we continue to see more military presence, particularly by PLA Navy vessels in areas where they had probably not been active beforehand. So this is the new norm. Unfortunately for Taiwan and United States, news of the Pelosi visit to Taiwan was leaked about a week and a half before she actually visited Taiwan, which gave Beijing to ramp up the rhetoric. On a daily basis, it was becoming more and more aggressive, which made it nearly impossible for the Chinese government then to de-escalate or to not do anything. So the Taiwanese are quite pragmatic. They are used to this kind of behavior by the Chinese, and also realize that a very large component of what we went through in the past couple of weeks was much more aimed at a Chinese domestic audience, but also signals of deterrence aimed at Taiwan and the United States, than an actual preparation for military invasion of Taiwan.
Is the blockade a real threat that Taiwan is facing now, more realistic than invasion?
Blockade has always been one of the options on the table for the PRC. And certainly a lot of the activity that we saw during the ramped-up exercises seemed to fit into that particular type of scenario. Now, I would say, however, that sustaining an embargo around Taiwan would be a very difficult proposition for the People's Liberation Army, largely because you cannot blockade Taiwan in a regional vacuum. So if you were to try to sustain a blockade, economic blockade, military blockade of Taiwan over several days, if not weeks, if not months, that would inevitably have an impact on regional economies. So countries like South Korea, countries like Japan, and down in the South China Sea, Philippines, Singapore, other major economies would also feel the repercussions of that blockade against Taiwan, to such an extent that, if only for economic reasons of global economy, you would start seeing major pressure on the part of major regional economies to bust that blockade, because that could not have an impact on their own economies as well. So the notion that China can blockade Taiwan without that having repercussions on the region, if not the international community, in my opinion, overstates Chinese ability to use that particular tool to coerce or punish Taiwan.
What are the possible or realistic scenarios from the Chinese perspective?
Well, short of a military invasion of Taiwan proper, the Chinese, if they still insist on a military response or military strategy against Taiwan, they could certainly try to seize some of Taiwan's islands in the South China Sea, or possibly, even though that would already ramp up de-escalation, some of Taiwan's outlying islands in the Taiwan Strait. So islands like the Matsu, Jinmen, and perhaps even Penghu Islands. That in and of itself would not be sufficient to break the will to resist on the part of the Taiwanese, let alone compel the government in Taipei to abandon its current policies and possibly give in to Chinese demands on unification. So those are the military options, if we can call them options, that would also inevitably spark a response from the United States, but also by the international community, not to mention the fact that these limited military operations would also compel the Taiwanese to do more for their own self-defense, because the threat would have become much more serious, much more real to them than the abstract under which they have lived over a number of years, if not decades. Now, short of military operations, there is a number of things that the Chinese could try to do in gray zone operations, things like efforts using disinformation, using underground proxies to try to destabilize Taiwanese society, to undermine the good functioning of its democratic institutions. You could rely upon pro-Beijing organized crime that is operating in Taiwan, to target individuals, to conduct sabotage against infrastructure, government institutions, and whatnot. Again, to try to sow chaos within the Taiwanese society, to undermine their belief in their government's ability to withstand pressure from China. And all these measures as well have a certain element of plausible deniability, which could then make it easier for Beijing to claim that it did not have a hand in these particular types of operations against Taiwan, and could claim that those were solely domestically generated in Taiwan, even though I don't think anyone here in Taiwan would believe these denials on Beijing's part. So these are all part of the constellation of tools at Beijing's disposal. My assessment, having been in Taiwan for several years, is that the Taiwanese are a lot more resilient, a lot more self-aware than people outside Taiwan oftentimes think, which to me says that democratic firewall that has been erected by the Taiwanese themselves gives them a lot more resilience to counter those efforts by China to undermine their morale, or to affect their support for the current government. And so much so that at the end of the day, I would maintain that Beijing's arsenal or its toolkit is actually quite limited.
And so what about Americans? What can be the American scenario or American reaction? Will Americans be patient enough to sustain growing Chinese pressure?
Well, I would say that American patience has certainly grown in recent years as the value of Taiwan, not only because of its role within the international or global economy, but more and more the assessment in Washington, D.C. that Taiwan as a frontline state has a major role to play in countering authoritarian influence globally, but certainly within the region in the Indo-Pacific. So the fact that Taiwan has more value has translated into bipartisan support within U.S. government for providing assistance to Taiwan, helping Taiwan bolster its deterrence, its defense capabilities, but also its self-confidence through engagement with the international community, oftentimes with support by United States. U.S. Congress has been very vocal, and we've seen a number of visits, and we continue to see them. Those will continue. Those are bipartisan in nature. One major change that we have seen in the past decade is within the executive branch of U.S. government, where in the past there tended to be a bit more skepticism of Taiwan, I would say, or certainly fears in Washington that certain elements within Taiwanese government, within Taiwanese politics, could cause trouble, if you will, in the Taiwan Strait. But that was largely in the context of U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, so they did not want to see the emergence of a third contingency, if you will, in the Taiwan Strait involving the Chinese military. Now, Afghanistan and Iraq are very much a thing of the past, at least in terms of major U.S. military involvement. There is currently contingency in Ukraine, but the Americans have sufficient capabilities to operate in two theaters simultaneously. Now, one important thing that U.S. government, I would counsel, should be doing in the coming weeks and months is through calculated actions to try to bring back some balance in the Taiwan Strait in the wake of the imbalance that was created by PLA activity in the past 2 weeks or so. It would be very important, for example, amid claims by Beijing that there is no such thing as a Taiwan Strait, that there is no tacit median line in the Taiwan Strait. It'll be very important for United States Navy, but also other world navies to resume transit in the Taiwan Strait, to reaffirm the position of the international community that those are indeed international waters. We will continue to see U.S. military presence in the region. It would help if you saw a larger number of countries, possibly Japan, but certainly European allies as well, increasing their presence in the area so as to bring back some stability and also signal to China that their altering of the status quo in the Taiwan Strait will not go unmet.
What can be the role of the European Union in this whole affair? What are the expectations in this regard in Taiwan? And also, can the Czech presidency of the Council of European Union be somehow involved in diplomatic negotiations?
Well, certainly having a united response from the EU as a bloc would be optimal, although we are conscious that it's very difficult for all EU members to be on the same page when it comes to these issues. And China has actually been quite good at exploiting the differences of opinion that exist among EU member states. But I would argue that one of the key roles that the EU could play prior, let's say, through an invasion scenario in the Taiwan Strait, it would be to have as united a front as possible, signaling that there would be major costs politically, but also economically, if the Chinese were to choose to use force in the Taiwan Strait. So I would say that the main role for the EU is not so much once there is an actual armed conflict in the Taiwan Strait, but prior to the possibility that this would happen. So in other words, a major role supporting other major economies, regional powers in Asia, in sending signals of deterrence to Beijing, to try to change their calculations as much as possible and to take them as far away as possible as the moment where they calculate that they could get away with a military invasion of Taiwan. So the more there is a promise of reputational, economic, diplomatic costs to engaging in that type of behavior, assuming rational decision-making in Beijing, the less likely it is that someone like Xi Jinping and his advisors, not to mention PLA generals, would think that the moment has now arrived for them to resolve the Taiwan issue, if you will, through force.
What are the lessons learned from the war in Ukraine for Taiwan as well as for China?
Well, that's a very important question. Certainly, the Chinese are paying very close attention at the moment to what's going on in Ukraine. The reaction by the international community has been quite muscular, certainly in terms of sanctions and provision of defense articles to Ukraine. If the Chinese conclude that Taiwan would secure similar support from the international community, that is not a given. but certainly work is being done to ensure that a number of countries would play a role. Again, that could contribute to deterrence against China. One thing that I suspect the Chinese have learned is that Vladimir Putin threatened for a number of days, if not weeks, that he would use major force at the outset of the invasion of Ukraine to subdue the Ukrainian military. So he mobilized a lot of troops, but the actual first wave or first push, if you will, was surprisingly limited, and it was easier for Ukrainian military to counter it. One possible lesson that the Chinese would have learned is that if at the outset they threatened to use massive military operations and a shock and awe kind of operation, they would have to go all out from the very beginning, so that they could knock out the Taiwanese military at the outset, rather than have it drag over weeks and months, as we've seen in Ukraine. Now, given the limited terrain in Taiwan and the high density of urban areas, if the Chinese were to decide to use overwhelming force, and that very likely would include large amounts of ballistic missiles, it is very likely that that would be catastrophic for Taiwan, and the human cost could also compel the international community to step in for humanitarian reasons. So the Chinese could calculate that that is the way to go, but again, reputational costs and potential response could actually be detrimental to Chinese interests. So that would also be part of their calculations. Another potential lesson learned from the Chinese is that this type of military operation might not be the best way to try to capture a government and subdue a population. Not to mention the fact that unlike Russian troops entering Ukraine via a land border, invading Taiwan is all the more complex because Chinese troops would have to cross the Taiwan Strait. So at its narrowest, about 110 kilometers. This is one of the most difficult types of military operations ever. So certainly the notion that the Chinese could accomplish a quick victory in the Taiwan Strait and put sufficient number of boots on the ground to occupy the government, not to mention the need to pacify a resisting population of 23.5 million people, it's a very, very difficult ask for the People's Liberation Army as well. So I'm optimistic that having seen the Russian debacle in Ukraine, the Chinese government at this point would conclude that military option, even though it's still on the table and very much part of its discourse on Taiwan, is probably not something that they want to use for the time being.
Thank you, Michael. That was another edition of Forum 2000 Online Chats with Michael Cole, Taiwan-based analyst focusing on Chinese influence.
Great being here. Thank you.